This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, brought to you by the IVT Network. As we will discuss opportunities and challenges in transitioning to risk-based monitoring in clinical trials this week. And given our current environment, it is no surprise that pharma and medical device companies are doing everything possible to boost efficiencies. Increasing drug development and production in safe and effective ways while limiting resources used and dollars spent can be a balancing act. So this also applies to clinical trials, of course, and adoption of a risk-based monitoring approach, or RBM, as we will refer to it, may be the best method to support clinical studies while keeping an eye on compliance. So we'll talk about the opportunities and challenges of implementing automated clinical trial management systems using RBM with today's guest, Amanda Coogan. So welcome, Amanda. So great to have you with us.
Hi, thanks so much. Great to be here.
Absolutely. So the idea of risk-based monitoring, or RBM, has been around since 2014, when the FDA published guidance, which entitled Oversight of Clinical Investigations, a risk-based approach to monitoring, which referenced this approach. Can you kick us off by explaining what RBM entails?
Sure. So at the core, what we're getting at with risk-based monitoring is ensuring the quality of clinical trials by identifying, assessing, monitoring, and mitigating any risks for that particular study that could affect the quality or safety. And really what you're trying to do when you're looking into this methodology, you want to define your risks associated with the protocol. This gets defined via what is called a risk assessment. We base those risks, again, on the protocol, on the therapeutic area, and also a lot of the time around operational metrics, how sites are performing, how patients are performing. And really what you're wanting to do is you want to focus on the primary and secondary, if there are secondary endpoints, but that primary or critical data points in the study. And what you're wanting to do from that point forward is look at monitoring and data management in a different way. And at this point, when you're establishing your monitoring plan or your data management plan, you want to start involving different types of monitoring. So moving away from what has been the industry standard for the past 20, 30 years, which is the idea of a clinical research associate or a CRA going out, conducting on-site monitoring visits, doing 100% source data verification, or SDV. And what we're wanting to do is move away from that idea. We want to have different types of monitoring, data monitoring that's completed by usually a couple of different roles. Again, really just focused on those primary or critical data points and looking at trend identification. Where are we seeing issues pop up? And the last big piece of RBM is, instead of doing this carte blanche monitoring approach where you're doing that 100% source data verification across all sites, no matter what, at this sort of standard frequency, we want to think about it a little more critically, and we want that monitoring to be more triggered, more targeted. And that's where that risk-based approach comes in. You're going to your sites that have more issues piping up, or your higher risk sites. Those are the ones that you want to focus on. And the other big piece of this is being flexible and adaptable as things change over time during the course of a study.
Yeah, all of that makes total sense. And of course, anytime you're doing clinical trials and you have a variety of different people involved, not only from the participant side, but also from the clinical side, I mean, there's a lot of different moving parts, I would think.
Sure.
So it's
Absolutely.
really important to have a well-defined system for managing all of this data. So,
Yep.
in the, 6 or 7 years since this really has been kicked off through the FDA's guidance or draft guidance, adoption has been, pretty slow. Historically, what have you seen or what do you note as the biggest challenges to implementation of an RBM system?
So I would say that there are three main issues here when it comes to implementation. First and foremost, it's been a fear of change, or this fear that if we shift away from that 100% source data verification, that is going to somehow jeopardize overall data quality, which has been proven time and time again is just not the case. But it's how things have been, for 20, 30 years. It's what we do. It's how most systems and processes are set up. It's the way that studies are budgeted and planned for based on those monitoring visits. So there's a lot of change that is involved in switching over. And I think a lot of people get a little bit of that paralysis, fear paralysis.
Right.
Yep. The other thing is when companies do kind of get maybe past that first hurdle, the fear of change, and they do start down the path, one place that I see them stumble or fall time and again is not getting things agreed upon with all stakeholders within the company early on. Everyone, not just your clinical teams, but anyone who is involved in any way within a clinical trial, they have to be on board with this new way of thinking. And it has to start early, and you have to have them involved early on, and you have to have that support.
Yeah, I would imagine it gets a little chaotic if not.
For sure. And then, you start thinking things about budgeting and all the different pieces that have to change, data management, how things would be run differently there. And everybody just needs to be on board. And a lot of it too is education. A lot of times people think because it's called risk-based monitoring, that it's, we only really need to worry about the monitoring team and that they know how to do this RBM thing, but it's so much broader than that. And the last thing is people overcomplicating the process. It is a big change. It is a new and different way of thinking. But once you understand what it is and what it looks like and what it can look like in practice, it's actually a quite streamlined, logical approach. But I think that people get overwhelmed with it and they overcomplicate it.
I think that happens whenever you have people involved, and the more cooks in the kitchen, the worse it gets, so to speak. So that makes total sense. So Amanda, as we increase our digital capacities and develop processes around trial automation, do you see an acceleration in adoption of RBM? And I'll let you answer that part first, but then adding on to that, where are we as an industry now, and where do you expect us to be in, say, 3 to 5 years?
So first part of the question, the acceleration and adoption of RBM, that's my sincere hope, is that that's what's happening. I'm seeing definitely, a lot more interest and sort of pickup in people asking and wanting to, dig in a little bit more into different technologies. So, I do see that, when we add all these different ways that we can collect data, where we can house data, handheld devices, that's just, the tip of the iceberg. But as we expand that way, all we're doing at that point is expanding the enormous amount of data that's collected in a study to begin with. And we're starting to then collect data and house data in all these different modalities. And on that side of the technology, it does make things more immense. But on the flip side, using technologies that are able to harness that data and aggregate the data from all the different sources, into one system, to me, that is the only way forward at this point. Because you need to be able to bring all of that data together just so you can wrap your head around what it is that you're working with in the study, but then use these technologies to manage the RBM aspects of the study as well, and to gain efficiency. So I think that, utilizing the technology capabilities, you have to be smart about it and not get overwhelmed by it. But it really is going to be the only way forward if you want to keep things running efficiently.
Yeah, I agree with that. Efficiency for sure, but accuracy too. I think when you use AI for any type of data analytics, computers are able to process so much more information in much less time than even a team of individuals can do, can process, and that only makes us better as an industry in terms of what we understand about what's happening in our clinical trials and in our manufacturing sites as well, right? Because we need to be able to review that and quickly make modifications or adjustments based on what we see happening. You talked about trends right at the beginning, and that's, the easiest way to identify trends, good or bad, is by using computers to process large amounts of data and really ferret that out for us. So, absolutely. Yeah, hopefully, and I agree with you. Hopefully we are moving in that direction, and people will continue to want to, use all of the digital capabilities that they have. And of course, the pandemic, that we're still here almost 2 years later, and it's brought about an accelerated adoption of digitization, digital technologies as a whole, where people have been working remotely and therefore needing to use certain tools and, logging in and relying on computers somewhat to do their jobs daily. So hopefully that is just, leading the horse to water, so to speak. Can you talk about the ways in which this may have helped or hastened the trend toward RBM?
So it's helped. It's helped immensely. And I joke about this with my colleagues all the time, that it truly took a worldwide pandemic to shake things up enough in the industry to get people to start thinking in different ways about how they can change their approach to monitoring and to running clinical trials. All of a sudden, people were grounded. You couldn't travel. You couldn't get out and do those regular monitoring visits where you were doing the 100% source data verification. You had to be on site for the most part. We do have technologies that allow to see into some medical records, but those have their own issues, if you will. They're not they're their own challenges. It's not always as straightforward as just showing up at the site. But all of a sudden, that was turned on its head, and companies had no choice if they wanted to continue moving forward with their clinical trials and getting drug or device to market. They're forced to find another way. Right. And so at that point, they were forced into remote monitoring or thinking of different ways that they can at least keep some checks on the data, and utilizing some of these other technologies where they were able to access, like I said, access medical records or access some of the other source documentation on site. That's where they had to go. But then at the same time, I think that it also, again, just opened their minds that things can be different and we could approach things in a different way.
Yeah, I agree. I've seen it not just in clinical trials, but really across industry, in all aspects of drug production, device production. People have had to be creative and figure out how they can use technologies to their benefit. And I think it would have taken a lot longer for people to get there had they not been forced into it, due to this pandemic.
For sure.
And so, we've already briefly mentioned the benefits to advanced technologies, AI, et cetera, in that the ability to analyze data more efficiently and accurately in larger sets is certainly something that AI brings to us. And we expect, that there's going to be many additional benefits to clinical trials based on the implementation of RBM. And I'm hoping you can provide your insights on this. In what ways do you see AI and big data and other technologies driving RBM?
Yeah. So the biggest thing is it's bringing all of the data into one system. It's having this ability to aggregate data from multiple different systems and bringing it all together in one place. And then from there, you have to be able to then do something with it. It's not enough from an RBM perspective to just bring all your data together and then look at it. You have to take it a step further. You have to have, along with that data, you have to have a system that is, a place for you to document your risks and your risk assessment, what your plan is for how you're going to manage and mitigate risk. And when you have all of that into one system, then you layer on the AI or the machine learning so that you are doing some aspects of some pre-planning. We can set some thresholds where we get alerts in the system as the data comes in, but we can utilize the system to tell us about things that we didn't know to expect, metrics or QTLs or that weren't really even a part of setting up that initial risk assessment. It's going to bring to light when you're able to look across all those different systems and to pull things together. So I do think that the biggest advantage there is efficiency. And like you said, using a computer or a system or some type of machine learning algorithm, it can do in 1 second what it might take one person or teams hours to do. As far as digging through data, analyzing and seeing trends, or bringing connecting the dots.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
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 So we began the conversation by saying that the adoption of RBM has been slow. Once we get people to that point, or organizations to that point where they understand, okay, this is an important tool for us, we need to start to shift or better plan for that shift. What are the biggest challenges you see here at this point in the process, actually making that transition?
Yeah. So if we've made it past the point of the sphere of change, and we do have everybody on board, and that this is the new way forward, again, so the first challenge I see is as part of that planning and the being proactive piece is you can't just go and shop for a technology and think that that's going to be the answer to your prayers, or the answer, to how you're going to run everything and it's going to be magic. That's not how it works.
Right.
There has to be the thought from the beginning of what are our processes going to look like? How are they going to change? Taking how you do things now and working through a change management process with your people that are currently involved in that particular company, the processes that already exist, and the existing technologies that are already there. So it's taking stock of what things look like now, and then thinking through how are we going to move forward, and how are each of those things going to need to shift or change as you move forward. And the other big piece there, and the big challenge, and this is just more a workload or a time constraint, and this is budgeting in time and effort at the beginning, not only to work through those changes and looking to see how processes and people's roles might change, but also that time to educate everyone who needs to be educated to understand what this RBM approach looks like and how things are changing, putting that time and effort up front and getting everybody on board. I think people really shift their focus or are thinking about what's this going to cost us, or what's this going to look like once we've picked a technology, or once we've kicked the study off, what does that budget look like? And when they're first getting started, they need to really be thinking and planning for plenty of time up front to kind of get their ducks in a row. And the other big piece is shifting the mentality of, in everything that they do, the documents, protocols, data management plans, monitoring plans, everything that they plan for within a particular study. The mindset is, how can we be proactive versus reactive?
So, I mean, obviously companies who run clinical trials as part of what they do every day. They're used to running the clinical trials. They know what data, in a sense, needs to be collected. So really, it sounds like the biggest shifts come in really now planning your processes around risk-based monitoring during trials, and training of personnel, and making sure that you're budgeting both time and resources to allow for this upfront.
Yes.
And as we really see increasing complexities in clinical trials, do you anticipate that's going to further impede a shift to RBM, or impact in any way the RBM process, even for folks who've maybe already adopted it?
So I think it depends on which complexities we're talking about. So one area of complexity, like I mentioned before, is this this huge foray into all these new data collection sources. I say new, but that's kind of been in the works for the past probably 15 years. But again, the handhelds, from your data coming in from smartwatch, smartphones, all of that, that complexity. And also, if we even start talking about DCT, decentralized clinical trials, where we're going to have a lot of different sources and more physicians, or different places where we're getting data. That side of things, in the increasing complexity, if you have a system like I talked about before, where you're aggregating all the data from all your different data sources, and then being able to do something with that, the complexity into all those different data sources would not really be a hindrance, because when you have a good system like that, it doesn't. You could be getting your data in 5 different sources, or 25. As long as you can get it all into one system, you're good.
Right.
However, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, right, because then you really can, your system can aggregate it for you, like you said, and you do get one data set or set of data, because it's already sort of gone through it all, which you would normally be doing manually prior to this, right?
Yep, for sure.
Yeah.
And
so it makes looking at the data that much easier, I would think.
For sure.
Yeah.
And I think too, if we're talking about complexities in a different way, complexities as far as within protocols themselves, and collecting a lot of different pieces of data, or different arms, and looking at things in different ways from a protocol standpoint. I think that it's more complex from a protocol standpoint doesn't always translate into a better trial or better data quality. Obviously, depending on therapeutic area, or the the investigational device, or the biologic or the drug that you're working with, some studies do need to be complex for different reasons. But making a study more complex just to collect a lot more data. I mean, the amount of data that I've seen collected in studies that is never looked at again, and it all just becomes sort of a byproduct of what you collect during a study. It makes a lot more noise, and a lot more leaves a lot more to clean up than it does to really help anything. So
Yeah,
think
and I would
another
add
way
to
to look
that
at it. Yeah.
you know, the regulatory complexities then kick in at that point, because if you've got clutter or noise or things that just don't belong, you know, data that just doesn't belong, like that's sometimes a red flag to regulators too. And that just makes the whole process that much more complicated.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes.
So, you know, to achieve maximum benefits requires total integration of RBM. It sounds like, you know, from everything that you're talking about, you need to have the buy-in, and this is not a process that you're going to baby step into. At least it sounds like that to me. So in your opinion, then what are the best ways for a company to begin moving toward full implementation of RBM?
So that's actually really interesting that you say that, because I do think that it is a common misconception or assumption of RBM, that um, that it's so big and such an overhaul that it's this very all-consuming process that you have to walk through. And I think that that's where a lot of people get some of their, change paralysis, or think that things need to be more complicated than they do. You can baby step into RBM.
Thank you for clarifying that. That's good to know. It sounds, because it doesn't sound that way sometimes, and I
Absolutely, because it's such a huge shift, and it touches so many different areas,
right,
that it seems like, you can't just be over here, because then you're going to become too siloed, and you need to incorporate, a lot of different pieces of the puzzle within a company. But we've actually seen the most success with people kind of dipping their toe in and baby stepping a little bit into RBM. And I will say that when we're talking about what that baby step would be, is just kind of back up again, just from thinking of it as risk-based monitoring. Yep. And we've been talking more of it as risk-based quality management, so RBQM. That's been a little bit of a kind of vernacular change over the course of the last couple of years. And the reason that that's important, why I say that, is because it's not just about changing up the monitoring, it's really changing the way that you think about managing the entire study. And so that would be what I would consider kind of a baby step before getting into a full implementation. It's just starting some of that mind shift change, again, just to get more people on board with this shift. And I think that another way that you actually can baby step is focusing on finding the right technology vendor for your company that really understands clinical data and clinical operations as well. That's the key piece, because you have to have someone in your corner, and you have to have someone that can walk you through not only the adoption of this new technology, which is a big step in and of itself, right, but how that technology fits into your entire RBQM process. And so it's also getting on board and having someone on board with you that's acting in a consultative role to help you through it. And also just starting with a pilot study. That is another way that we have seen companies really be able to make a smoother transition into this, is pick one study. And it's a study that's either one that's upcoming, new, or it could be a previous study. But just focus on that one and see how you make the shift in one study, and then start opening up to what this looks like across the board.
That's great advice. I love the idea of picking one study and just kind of testing it out, see how it goes. what's one thing, I'm just thinking like as an action item for our
Yeah.
listeners today, if they are interested in doing this and they say they take your advice and they pick one study that they're going to try risk-based monitoring to implement that, what's one or two things you really think they need to keep in mind so that they can actually move the needle here?
Yeah. So one very concrete thing that they can do is complete a risk assessment for a study. So there are, a couple different templates out there. There's a RACT, and there's resources out there via Transcelerate, and then there's been a lot more have come out in the past few years. But just complete a risk assessment. Sit down with it. It's an Excel, kind of Excel formatted type spreadsheet,
Right.
but just start walking through that process for one study. And then another way is to, again, just start brainstorming, put a group together, put an RBM, RBQM pilot group together, right? That could be 3-4 people,
Right.
From a couple of different areas, and get that team and have them take a look at current processes, current SOPs, the way that monitoring is done right now, or data management, and see how you can start shifting into a more risk-based approach. What does it look like if you don't do 100% SDV and regularly scheduled on-site monitoring visits? What are ways that you can pare that back a little bit?
And
Yeah.
Amanda, who do you recommend from the team is essential in to be involved in this brainstorming and risk development process?
Yep. So first, it's your clinical operations folks. So if you have different members of your study teams, study managers, you can have CRAs, your clinical research associates, or management of your CRAs,
Mm-hmm.
data management as well, because ultimately that's what this is all coming down to,
Right.
is looking at data. So at the beginning, when you're starting the brainstorming sessions, I think it's always great just to have your operations people to be in those first sessions, because they're going to be the ones that sort of understand the day-to-day and how that's going to be impacted.
Excellent. Amanda, some great information today, and I really appreciate you sharing your insights in terms of where we are and hopefully where we're headed with risk-based monitoring. And as we get ready to wrap today, I just wanted to see if you had any last thoughts or ideas that you'd like to leave with our listeners.
Yeah, so I have three things that that whenever I'm talking with anyone about getting into the RBM or RBQM world, and those are: do not overcomplicate RBQM.
Very important.
Do not overcomplicate it. It really is, when you're working with someone who understands it, understands how to implement it, it really is a straightforward, logical approach to running a clinical trial. Don't just do things to do them just because it's the way it's always been done. Have this mentality of a flexible, proactive mentality, and think about monitoring in a different way, moving away from the CRA on-site type visit to a combination of maybe some of those on-site visits, along with central remote monitoring, along with data management, but keeping with this sort of regular remote monitoring or central monitoring or surveillance, I even like to call it, so that people don't, they can kind of move away from that standard idea of monitoring. But keeping that regular surveillance is going to keep the finger on the pulse of your data. And it's your best way, obviously utilizing technology to identify issues and trends early so you can course correct. And then the last thing is always to just take a step back, and in keeping things simple, really think critically about what matters in your trial, which typically that's related to your primary, secondary, safety and efficacy endpoints. And don't get lost in, collecting a bunch of data. Just focus on high priority, critical data. And that's really going to help you when you're developing your risk assessment and what you're focusing on as far as tracking and managing your risks. You want to really keep yourself focused to what's really important.
Some excellent points to leave with our listeners. So thank you. I really appreciate your time today, Amanda. This has been great. I love that you were able to share your insights and accounts on this topic. So much appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I also want to give a shout out to our producer, Ben Kitchen. And most importantly, I'm sending out my thanks to you, our valued listeners. I appreciate your time each week, as well as your help in sharing this podcast. So together we need to continue spreading the word. As always, if you enjoyed today's episode, please remember to subscribe in your podcast player of choice and be sure to share with your friends and colleagues, as well as your online network so they can enjoy it too. Plus, send us a quick note or leave an online review. We'd love to hear from you. For show notes and additional podcast resources, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com/podcast. We'll be back again next week with another informative and timely discussion. Until then, make it a great week.